On Friday night, Lateline revealed 3 multinational tobacco companies have spent millions of dollars advertising against government plans to introduce plain cigarette packaging. They've done it covertly through a front group called the Alliance of Australian Retailers. Today, several health groups called for government action to prevent that situation from occurring again. To discuss that matter and other issues in the health portfolio, I'm joined from Canberra tonight by the Federal Health Minister Nicola Roxon. Thank you for your time.
It's a pleasure.
What is the government's response to that Lateline story from Friday?
Well, what I think it shows very clearly is that big tobacco companies around the world are determined to stop our new plain packaging measures. The reason the government wants to introduce them is that we know tobacco is a killer. We know that 15,000 Australians die every year. We know that plain packaging is one way to make cigarettes even less attractive, particularly to young or new smokers. And I'm sure that's why the big tobacco companies want to fight it tooth and nail. Australia will be the first country around the world to take this step. And I'm very concerned that large amounts of money are going to be spent to try to turn this policy around when it's clearly going to benefit the health of Australians and is something that our government should be able to do, and we are very determined to continue with.
Vic Health and the Public Health Association of Australia are calling on the government to legislate for a complete ban on tobacco advertising, including through front groups. Is that something the federal government will consider?
Well, of course, there is a ban on tobacco advertising in terms of selling the product. I think what these groups have been raising is this really a way of keeping cigarettes at the front of people's minds, even although it's a campaign about and attacking our policy. So I'm really determined to make sure that the government can take steps that will save lives. And one of the ways of doing that is to try to remove every last ability of a company to advertise their products, and their colours and their logos in the packaging are part of doing that. And that's why we're determined to go ahead with this legislation. I hope the Liberal Party will support us. Mr Abbott initially did, then he sort of drew back from that position. There have been suggestions that there were, donations made. I don't know if that's right or not, but I hope that Mr Abbott and the Liberal Party will support these measures when they come before the Parliament, because it can save many, many thousands of lives.
Have you had discussions with the Independents and the Greens to garner their thoughts on this?
I have previously had discussions with the Greens. We dealt with them a lot on a range of preventative health measures, and they've been very keen to support our preventative health agenda. I haven't yet had the opportunity to discuss this particular piece of government policy with the other independents. Of course, we'll be doing that. Because this is the first time this step's been taken around the world, we've actually set aside some time for proper research, careful drafting of the legislation. We know it's likely to be challenged by the tobacco companies in the High Court. So we will make sure that we do all of our preparatory work properly, which will allow for plenty of consultation with the community and, of course, with the new Parliament.
So even allowing for that, what is the timetable then for the introduction? When would we expect to see those cigarette plain packaging packets in shops?
Well, the timetable is for it to be introduced, for it to commence on the 1st of January 2012, but for there to be a 6-month window for old stock and other things to be sold so that it would be fully enforced by the 1st of July 2012. So that means we've got a lot of the preparatory work to do this year, some final consultations and testing next year, and being able to, hopefully, with the support of the Parliament, pass the legislation to allow that change on the 1st of January 2012.
And how much of this preparatory work is about making the legislation watertight, given this legal challenge that you're anticipating?
Well, it's about both making this legislation as appropriate and as watertight as it can be, but it's also about the testing for, when you say plain packaging, what does the package actually have to look like? What size should the warnings be? How will you identify different brands? They have to be able to be identified, for example, by the retailer. Should it be plain gold packaging? Should it be plain grey packaging? All these sorts of things that get tested to make sure we choose the least attractive option so that we are able to have the impact to the best extent possible to reduce the appeal of smoking. So there's a fair bit of testing and a fair bit of effort that goes into that side of it, the actual graphic design, as well as making sure our legislation is completely clear and we hope will withstand any sort of challenge.
In terms of the opposition and possible challenges, hasn't the government made a rod for its own back here on the cigarette packaging? Because with the back down on the mining tax, haven't you sent a message to big wealthy industries like tobacco that if they mount a ferocious enough political campaign that you will back down?
Well, I think what we've seen is something relatively new in Australia, where you do see big industry players buying directly into advertising right in the middle of an election campaign.
And is that appropriate?
I think, in a democracy, it's legal. I think people have to form their own views about whether it should sway their vote, whether it's appropriate or not. This isn't new for big tobacco. They've fought every limitation on advertising, on restricting sale ever introduced in this country and around the rest of the world. But that shouldn't make us afraid of taking a step which we know is right. The evidence about tobacco is very clear. It's not like we're waiting for some final information to come in about whether this is a safe product or not. We know it kills people. We know there are thousands of chemicals that are inhaled every time you smoke a cigarette. We know it's worth taking this fight. We'll be doing everything to make sure that we can succeed in introducing plain packaging, but we are not naive about how hard big tobacco will fight us on that front.
If we can turn now to the new Cabinet and begin with the decision to do away with Indigenous health as its own separate portfolio, why will Indigenous health get more attention when it's under the enormous health portfolio than it would by having its own dedicated minister?
Well, actually, what you will find tomorrow is that Minister Snowden, who has been dealing with rural and Indigenous health, will also be sworn in an ongoing role as an Indigenous health spokesperson. But we will be continuing to work. He's got vast experience in this area, but I will also, as I have in the past, continue to play a role as the Cabinet Minister responsible for Indigenous health. We do know that Warren has a very established relationship through his electorate being in the Northern Territory and from his history working in Indigenous health and housing and elsewhere, and he wants to continue that role, and that's something that the Prime Minister and I have asked him to do, and he's agreed to, and that will be announced tomorrow, and he will be sworn in that role, as well as his new role as the Veterans Affairs Minister.
And so what will that role be called? And you said Indigenous health spokesman, so will he have any actual power? Or what does it involve?
Oh, absolutely. It means that he will be sworn in as both the Veterans Affairs Minister and as the Indigenous Health Minister. It means he retains a role in my portfolio, one that he feels very passionately about, and I know the sector works very well with him. Both the Prime Minister and I didn't want to lose that experience, but it does mean, as I have in the past, that I will continue to play the role as the Cabinet Minister, responsible for overall policy settings, which of course have an impact in Indigenous health, but it means we'll have an extra pair of hands and someone very dedicated to Indigenous health remaining in that area.
And so why the change to the original announcement?
Look, obviously we were very determined, and the Prime Minister made clear that she wanted a big focus on a range of key challenges. Health is one of those, but obviously staying as the Health Minister, having a lot of our reforms bedded down, and this term of government being about implementing those reforms and taking on some new challenges. I guess with the other changes, wanting to focus on jobs and productivity, wanting to make sure we've got a very strong economic team in place, it was something that perhaps wasn't focused on as much. We've seen that. We've made this change. The Prime Minister has asked Warren, and I have asked Warren, to stay on in that role, and I think it's a very good outcome.
So are you saying that it was perhaps overlooked in the flurry of activity around other things?
Look, we made a strategic decision, as you've seen from the Prime Minister's announcement, to have a very strong focus on the economy, on productivity, on jobs. I think all of that is appropriate. And you've seen a fair number of the social policy ministers stay in their portfolio areas, myself and Jenny Macklin. But I think that it is important to make sure that we can have a dedicated role. Warren has a lot of experience. We didn't want to lose that experience. He didn't want to stop doing it. And there's an opportunity for him to do that, as well as his new role as the Veterans Affairs Minister.
During the election, mental health professionals came out in support of the package that the Coalition offered in that area, and today the Coalition is saying that by establishing a new mental health ministry, Labor is clearly playing catch-up. Is that the case?
No, it's not the case that we're playing catch-up, but it is the case that we want to bring a more dedicated focus to mental health.
Is that an acknowledgement that there hasn't been enough of a focus in your first term?
Well, we were very upfront about the fact that we were focused on the overall health system and that reforming it and getting it right has a benefit for patients who have mental health issues as well. But we've made no secret of the fact that mental health and aged care are both two key areas where we need a strong second-term focus. We've asked our junior minister, my junior minister, Mark Butler, to take the particular lead on that. We'll be working very closely together because any sorts of reforms or new investments will need to complement the reforms that we are already introducing across the entire system. And I think this gives us the person power or the manpower to be able to do that well.
The Australian of the Year, Professor Pat McGorry, says if Julia Gillard is really serious about making it a second-term priority, that she should establish a prime ministerial task force, because when it's under prime ministerial auspices, things actually happen. Is that a possibility?
Look, we always take seriously the sorts of proposal that Pat puts forward. He's a very well-respected Australian and very passionate about making sure that we can provide better mental health services to the community. So I'll consider any sorts of options that he puts forward. We're about to be sworn in tomorrow. Mark will be a new minister with particular responsibility in this area, and those are issues that he and I and the Prime Minister will want to discuss to make sure that we can really tackle what has been a problem for many, many decades and make sure that this government can make the significant difference that's needed in mental health.
So that is a possibility then, a prime ministerial task force. It's something that you will consider?
Well, we will consider any proposals that Mr McGorry puts forward, but we do have a ministerial advisory committee. I think there have been some difficulties with that. I think we can afford to look again at whether we've got the right mix of people, whether it needs to be structured in a different way, and I'm sure that many stakeholders will have different views about the best way to progress mental health policy. That's something that, as a new minister, Mark Butler will want to have input into. I, as the Cabinet Minister, will want to, and I'm sure the Prime Minister, who feels very strongly about mental health and the importance of us getting this right in the second term, will also have a view on.
On the getting the right mix of people on that committee, there was that high-profile resignation earlier, I think this year, by Professor John Mendoza. Would you like to see him get back on board in a direct way?
Oh, look, I think that John obviously played an important role. He was frustrated. He obviously resigned. I think that we need to just take a deep breath, settle down a little bit and look at the way we want to be able to go about consulting the community and getting this policy right. I don't think it helps for me on Lateline to, be announcing any individuals that can and can't do that. We need to look at a way that we embrace a much broader community. Ultimately, the most important of which are the patients and those who suffer from mental health issues and problems, and making sure that they get the services that they need. I think there are a great many people across the country who want to be involved in that process, and I don't want to announce on television tonight or tie my hands or the government's hands as to the best way for us to be able to take this forward. It hasn't been done well in the past, and we want to get it right for the future.
There, as you know, are some very alarming statistics about the incidence of mental health problems in Australia, as there are very deeply concerning statistics about Aboriginal health. So, for example, that Indigenous Australians die on average about 20 years earlier than their fellow Australians. In terms of accountability, how should we voters gauge the success of your government in these very worrying areas? Should we look at the statistics in 3 years and see, OK, if those figures have moved, that's a success? How will we actually be able to gauge that?
Well, I think this is a challenge across the entire health system, not just for people who have mental health concerns, because there haven't been good indicators and there hasn't been national data properly collected. And one of the big reforms that was agreed to at COAG is for us to actually provide proper data and proper measurements across about 70 different areas, including those in mental health, but including infectious diseases, including hospitalisation rates, including the Indigenous, of course, life expectancy. So I think that is an important step. We're introducing a whole range of other accountabilities, like at the My Hospitals website that the Liberal Party has opposed. These things are about improving accountability, and I think we do have to acknowledge that in health terms, sometimes the indicators of improvement are slow, but we can often find proxies that show us improvements. Are more people getting more services? Are people getting to the right service provider in time? time? Are people presenting at hospitals when they should have had care earlier? We do have to get smarter about how we measure that, but I think using those as proxies in the interim is not a bad way to know if we're meeting the needs of the community and if we can do more.
Nicola Roxon, Health Minister, thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.